Okay. All right, I think we're good to go. So, like I said, talk about Petronila and San Fernando Creek Watershed Protection Plan this morning. And basically what we're going to do is hit the highlights of what all is in the plan. So we've been, I guess, about this time last year, maybe I think it's first part of February is when we had our kickoff meeting for the project to talk about basically coming up with a plan to address the water quality issues and concerns here in the two creeks. And so basically, I'm going to present the watershed plan overview. We're going to go through it chapter by chapter and talk about the content that's there. And then along the way, I want y'all to chime in and tell me what's good, what's bad, what's ugly, what maybe is missing. If y'all have any questions, comments, concerns, or anything like that along the way, please do let me know. Because at the end of the day, this plan is only as good as the content that goes into it. So if there's something that y'all aren't comfortable with or anything like that, please do ask some questions and we will discuss that until we're ready to move on to the next topic. And so this presentation is kind of the predecessor to me sending out the final document, or not, I'm sorry, the draft of the final document. So basically, I'll take the discussion today, make some final adjustments as needed, and then send that thing out to y'all tomorrow, Friday, just depending on if there's some big changes. It might take me a little bit longer to get it up to speed, but as soon as that thing's ready to go, I'll send that out to y'all for review and comment. And then from there, we'll receive comments back, make further adjustments to the plan, and move on down the line. And we'll end the presentation today with kind of the review process for the watershed protection plan and some tentative timelines for what we think that's going to look like. And then we'll talk about just the final wrap up of everything. So chapter 1 of the document is really just kind of an overview about what watershed protection planning is. So it talks about how these watershed plans are literally built to address everything going on water quality wise within a watershed. They're not just focused on a specific problem, which in this case, the bacteria concentrations in both creeks are higher than the state's water quality standard. So hence the reason that we're here to work to address these problems and come up with some solutions to reduce those bacteria concentrations in the water body. But basically, this chapter describes that process, describes all the ins and outs of it, and talks about what the watershed approach actually is and how it works to address these issues. The chapter also outlines the 9 key elements of the successful watershed protection plan that EPA has published. And ultimately, this plan will go up to EPA for review. And the reason that they review these plans is to make sure that we're actually checking these boxes or checking off these successful elements of the plan. And once they say that, yes, this plan actually adheres to these elements and outlines all the items that they say needs to be in there, then it unlocks the door for potential grant funding to help implement this plan. So each of these elements is scattered in throughout the watershed plan. It's not, we don't have a title in there that says causes and sources or anything like that, but they're included in the watershed protection plan. And one of the items that we include in the appendices of the plan spells out where each of these elements are. So we basically help EPA make sure that they know where that content is in the plan. But each of those elements is described in detail to talk about what they actually are, and basically just to provide some insight on what we're trying to do with the plan. So chapter 2 really starts to get into some watershed details. So it talks about the watershed in kind of what we call a characterization term, where we're describing the watershed itself, the size, the extent of the watershed, where it is. We include maps like the ones that are set up over here by the check-in desk, just to show the area that we're actually talking about. We talk about the physical characteristics of the watershed. So the soils, the topography, things of that nature, because water still flows downhill. It also flows towards money in a lot of cases, but in nature, it flows downhill. So that obviously has a big bearing on what goes on. Same with soils. I mean, you get sandy soils, not as much water comes off of those, but if you have some heavy clays and stuff like that, obviously you're going to get more runoff from those areas. So there's maps and descriptions of those physical characteristics. We also talk about land use and land cover. So this is another big factor that weighs in on kind of some of the planning and assessments that are done to evaluate management recommendations from across the watershed. So obviously the land use has a big bearing on that. So if we're talking about something in an urban setting, it's not going to be in the middle of nowhere. So obviously you need to have that land use map to show where those concretes are, where the urban landscapes are, things like that. Same with ag. If we're talking about doing something relative to managing livestock, it's not going to be in downtown Kingsville or anything like that. So having a good working knowledge of how many of the acres of cropland, of grassland, of urban land there are across the watershed is important. So we have, again, those maps, break down the acreages by watershed and present that information. Population, like human population, also important in here as well. A lot of the sources are tied to where the people are. So if we're talking about septic systems in rural areas, that's obviously where the people are. If we're talking about pets, they're associated with people in most cases. We got some wild ones running around. I know my dog's a little wild. She was actually a stray, so she used to not be associated with a person, but she is now. But anyways, we talk about those population densities, provide information about that, and also have some census data that talks about people per household and things like that, which goes into some of the assessments down the line. And then we have some more just general information about the watershed that helps kind of provide some context to the whole plan. So the ecoregion that we're in, the climate, like rainfall patterns, temperatures, things of that nature, and then the extent of aquifers in the area. Just again, it's also a water resource, not necessarily the one that we're talking about, but water is connected across the landscape. So that chapter 2 really talks about that information from a 30,000 foot perspective. Chapter 3 is where we get into some water quality conversations and discussions. So this chapter really kind of sets the benchmark. So we talk about the state's water quality standards, how water bodies are assessed, and present those numbers, which are our targets for meeting that water quality. So the water body assessments that the state does are done on a 2-year cycle. So every other year, they publish a report called the Texas Integrated Report on Water Quality. And it basically defines what water quality has been in each water body that they evaluate across the state. Now, they don't evaluate all water bodies, just I guess what you would claim are the bigger ones. So if it's a ditch flowing down the side of the road after a rain event, they're not doing anything there. But your larger creeks, rivers, bays, estuaries, things of that nature are all included in those water body assessments. And in the vast majority of cases, they use a 7-year moving window of data to do those assessments. So basically there's a 2-year lag. They've got to have time to evaluate the data and publish the assessment and all that. So they can't use data that was collected last week in that assessment. They've got to have time. So basically the 2020 assessment that was pushed out last, the data collection for that one stopped at the end of 2018. And it went the previous 7 years. And that's basically the report card on water quality across the state. Now that report card, it is actually looking at how water quality stacks up against these Texas surface water quality standards. And those standards are published by TCQ. They're available online. If you have insomnia and need a fix, go read those water quality standards. It'll put you right to sleep. But that's basically all the legal speak and all the ins and outs of those water quality standards. Each water body is designated to have a certain set of standards that it needs to adhere to. So you can see over here in this table that we've got various different uses for water bodies. So contact recreation, that's where the bacteria comes into play. And then aquatic life use, that's where dissolved oxygen comes into play. So depending on what the use category is and water body type, we have different standards. So in this case, Petronila tidal is primary contact, but it's tidal water, so influenced by salt. It has a standard of 35 colony forming units of bacteria, which are Enterococcus. In your freshwater, so Petronila upstream, where it's freshwater, and then San Fernando, it also has that primary contact standard, but it uses a different indicator because of the freshwater. So that's 126 colony forming units of E. coli. And then similarly, with aquatic life use, it has different dissolved oxygen standards based on the use category. So salt water or tidal waters, high aquatic life use has an average of 4 milligrams per liter and a minimum of 3 milligrams per liter for oxygen. Whereas your fresh waters, the intermediate use is the same as 4 and 3, but a high use actually has a higher minimum threshold for that average dissolved oxygen use. So anyways, those are kind of the differentiations between the water bodies and portions of the water body. And each of the water bodies is also broken up by assessment units. So there's various subsets of a water body that have different standards applied to it in some cases. In many cases, the standards are the same for the multiple assessment units, but not always. So that's all defined in the watershed plan. We provide maps to show where those assessment units are and provide details on what standards each assessment unit is actually adhering to. So I kind of touched on the dissolved oxygen standard already. And like I said, they do vary by freshwater and tidal waters. So if it's salty, it is physically unable to hold as much oxygen as freshwater. So there's a slightly less restrictive standard that's applied to those tidal waters than it is for freshwaters. And then nutrients is the other big item that gets evaluated. So in Texas, there are not currently nutrient standards for flowing water bodies. Some reservoirs have them, and I guess there's a couple of cases where nutrient standards have been developed, but it's pretty rare. So here locally, no nutrient standards at this point. There are screening levels that have been established for ammonia, nitrate, chlorophyll A, total phosphorus, and things of that nature. And what those screening levels are is basically the state took the statewide average of all similar water bodies, so all fresh waters and all tidal waters, and established the 85th percentile. So what was the 85th percent value for all statewide numbers? And that's what they set these screening levels at. So for freshwater, the screening levels are these numbers here in this column. And for tidal water, the chlorophyll A is 21. And I see that I omitted adding in the tidal levels for ammonium nitrate and total phosphorus, but they're actually pretty close to those values for freshwater as well. So basically, what they do to evaluate whether or not there's a screening level concern is if 20% of the samples that are collected for that specific station are above that 85th percentile, then they say there's a concern for elevated ammonia or nitrate, chlorophyll A, total phosphorus, things of that nature. So, and chlorophyll A, you might be thinking that's not a nutrient. That's actually an indicator of nutrient concentrations in the water body. So chlorophyll A, it's actually a green pigment in plants. Plants obviously use nutrients to grow. So the measure that they do is actually a measure of that chlorophyll A content in the water, which is related back to nutrient concentrations. And it's actually a more broad measure. So if you're looking at these specific nutrients, the ammonia, nitrate, total phosphorus, they're not painting the full picture. They're specifically looking at that item. And there's inorganic, organic versions of a lot of the nutrients that are out there, and they're one or the other. So chlorophyll A, it looks at the whole nutrient profile essentially and says, all right, this is either above that screening level or not. So chapter 4 of the watershed plan, it actually talks about some potential pollution sources across the water body. And these are just general overviews of what the sources are that are out there. And these are in no particular order by any stretch of the imagination. Just this is what my student typed up whenever he typed it all up. So first on the list is wastewater treatment facilities. And we also include in there sanitary sewer overflows. That's what the SSO stands for. And basically, wastewater treatment facilities, whenever they're designed and working as designed, they do a really good job of taking care of pollutants in human waste. But whenever operation and maintenance isn't maybe done as well as it should be, or if system components age, things happen out there, pipes get broken, things of that nature, things can go downhill a little bit. So bacteria are obviously a concern from wastewater treatment facilities. Nutrients are as well. If you think about how those systems works, they're aggregating all of the human waste that gets put into the wastewater system into a point, treating it, and then discharging it out into a nearby water body. So they can have a significant impact on in-stream water quality if they're not properly functioning. So some of the big physical concerns with the wastewater treatment facilities are overflow or overload from large storm events. A lot of these systems have been in the ground for a while, especially the collection systems, and maybe old pipes that are deteriorating, cracks, breaks, things of that nature. Then you get a big rain event, and water, like stormwater, could be entering into the wastewater collection system and physically overloading that wastewater plant. So it doesn't have enough time to treat that wastewater to the required level that it should be. And those conveyance system failures are really the culprit there. And then again, just the physical age and operational status of the various components of those systems could be problematic. Moving down the list, we have septic systems. This is another potentially big component of bacteria and nutrient loading across the watershed. The septic systems are obviously utilized heavily in rural areas, and they provide a great service to us. And when they're properly designed, properly installed, properly functioning, they do a great job of taking care of our household waste. But those system failures do occur due to age, due to lack of maintenance, improper maintenance, moving soils, things like that can all cause failures in those systems. And a lot of times those failures are not realized until something starts backing up in the house. When that happens, people tend to get pretty excited about their septic system. But as long as the toilet flushes and everything goes outside, it's generally not a big concern. So there's a lot of cases where maybe there are septic systems that have been in the ground for 30, 40, 50 years that aren't doing the job that they once were, that could be improved upon. And depending on where they're located across the watershed, they may or may not have a big potential impact on water quality. So if they're close to a stream and failing, then you get a rain event, and it's pretty easy for that failing septic system to influence that creek. Now, if it's 20 miles from the water body and in the middle of flat country, probably not going to have that big of an influence, even if it is failing. So that's one that that could be a big source across the watershed, and is one that there should be some priority placed on which systems really are addressed across the water body. Urban runoff and really stormwater runoff in general is another big concern. So again, bacteria, nutrients, things like that get picked up along with a lot of other things, lots of trash and metals and oils and all kinds of fun stuff gets picked up in that runoff and carried downhill into the creeks and streams. Urban areas tend to concentrate these things, so you have parking lots and things of that nature where cars are leaking stuff, and there's a lot of pets in town where people are concentrated. So pet waste, if it's not properly disposed of, can certainly have an influence on water quality whenever it rains and stuff gets washed downhill. So that's a big source. Livestock can also be a big source of nutrient and bacteria concentrations in the watershed. Livestock are obviously out there across the landscape doing their thing. And whenever it's not raining, obviously it's not a big potential influence on water quality. The one, I guess, exception to that is that if cattle do have access to a stream for source of water or just crossing to the other side, when they're down there, they very well could do their business in or near the water body, which has a bigger influence on that in-stream water quality. So they're a potential source as well. Wildlife, also a big source. There's lots of wild critters running around out there. Really too many to shake a stick at, to be honest with you. But the ones that we have numbers on and information about are white-tailed deer and feral hogs. And that's the tip of the iceberg, to be honest with you. I mean, there's tons of other critters out there, but those two species are, white-tailed deer are a huge revenue source for the state of Texas. Parks and Wildlife does annual deer surveys. We've got density estimates, things like that. Feral hogs are like the bane to society, and everybody hates them and wants to get rid of them. So there's been some work done on those guys as well. So we know what those populations are, but raccoons, possums, squirrels, junk like that, nobody counts squirrels and possums and raccoons. So we don't have a good idea about how many there are out there across the watershed. But nonetheless, a lot of these wild critters hang out around creeks and rivers because that's where cover is, that's where food is, that's where water is. So they can certainly have an impact on water quality as well. And then pets, I mentioned them earlier with the urban runoff. So again, especially where they're concentrated in town, is a bigger potential source. And if that people don't pick up after their dogs, it easily gets carried downstream whenever it rains. And then the last item on the list is illegal dumping. And it's bigger than just bacteria and nutrients. It's just, one, it's an eyesore. Two, it's just litter into the water bodies that doesn't need to be there. And then who knows what else is in that stuff as well. And honestly, it's probably the least of the potential contributors from a bacteria perspective on the list, but nonetheless, it's still a pretty substantial problem here locally, and certainly one of those that it would be good if we could get it addressed. And I guess the other thing is trash also begets more trash. So if there's a pile of trash under the bridge, the next person that comes along with trash in the back of the truck is like, oh, I'll just add my little pile of junk as well. So cleaning that up would help maybe minimize that down the line. So chapter 5 gets into the pollution source assessment. And this is really looking at recent water quality across the water bodies and kind of evaluating where things stand as compared to those water quality standards. So these graphs just kind of aggregate the data from the multiple water bodies and sampling stations. And in both cases, the red line that goes across these bar graphs is the water quality standard. And what we would love to see is more of these dots, which are the individual sampling points below that line than above it. And then the blue box plots, they actually represent the 25th percentile, the mean of all the data, and then the 75th percentile. So really the mean value is kind of what we're looking at in this case. And obviously here, this is Petronila freshwater portion of Petronila, so the most downstream portion. And you can see that the water quality, I think the mean bacteria value there is significantly above that water quality standard, which is not what we want to see, obviously. Same thing when you go upstream a little bit further to the next sampling station. Again, that mean value is up there a pretty good bit. There is a station even further upstream where it's actually good. So water quality is not as big of a concern the farther up the hill you go, per se. And there's a lot of different factors that weigh in on this. It's basically contributions into the water body at that point in the watershed. It's the nature of the stream right there. If it's flowing nicely, or if it's maybe more ponded or pooled, that can weigh in on water quality. And then San Fernando Creek is the same. Water quality standard is exceeded in that case as well. So across the board, basically bacteria levels are above what the state wants them to be. So both Petronila and San Fernando are considered impaired. Then I guess the tidal portion of Petronila, the mean values are actually pretty close to the Enterococcus standard, but still above that standard. So still considered impaired there as well. So that's one way that we look at the pollutant sources. The next is, well, I'm sorry, before I get to the next slide, this is just a table that presents the nutrient concentrations that have also been recorded from samples collected out there across the water bodies. And the boxes that are highlighted in yellow are the ones that are above that screening level concern for each of those various parameters. So you can see San Fernando Creek, nitrate, chlorophyll A, and total phosphorus are all above that screening level. So it's obviously got something going on nutrient-wise there. Petronila Creek, really chlorophyll A is the biggest indicator that's out of line here. Total phosphorus in, I guess, the upper extent of the creek is pretty fairly above that phosphorus standard. It's about 3 times, or I'm sorry, phosphorus screening level, not a standard. It's about 3 times that screening level, maybe even 4. So that's obviously a concern. But the chlorophyll A is really the one that shows that things are out of whack, because that chlorophyll A screening level is 14.1, and you can see that most values are considerably above that that threshold there for chlorophyll A. And then the next way we look at pollutant loading across the watershed is to do load duration curves. And basically what this is a combination of the bacteria concentrations with flow estimates for the water body. And we plot those out over the course of the flow regime. So it's not necessarily related to time. This is related to where it was on a flow perspective. So each of these points represents a specific sample. And the points on the right-hand side of the graph were samples that were collected during low flow conditions. So summertime, no tropical rain events or anything like that when that flow is really, really low. The left-hand side of the graph is your higher flow. So this is stuff that's definitely been influenced by recent runoff. Might be a big tropical event or just a good rainmaker that moved through and generated some runoff. So basically, what this does is it shows us how bacteria behave based on the flow conditions in the stream. Because moving water picks up and carries stuff with it, both in stream and across the landscape. So if you get a big rain event that generates a lot of runoff, odds are it's going to be carrying stuff with it that throws water quality out of whack. And in this case, the average load estimate is this red box here in the middle. And this black line is what the water quality standard would be across that same flow regime. So what we would want to see is this box below that line. Obviously, you can see from the highest flow conditions, the kind of normal conditions, and then the low flow, that each of those mean values is above that water quality standard, which agrees with the box plots that I showed you just a bit ago, that the mean values are above that standard. So basically what that is saying is that we need to work to reduce those bacteria levels in the stream to meet that water quality standard, really under all conditions. So it's not just high flow that's causing the problem, or not just low flow that's causing the problem. And really this graphic helps us understand maybe the types of pollutant that we're dealing with. So for example, if the mean value was only higher than the allowable value here in these low flow conditions, that would tell us that it's something that is directly impacting the water body that's causing the bulk of the problem. So this will be animals that are directly defecating into the stream. This will be wastewater treatment plants that are directly discharging wastewater into the stream. Because under these low flows, there's no rainfall runoff coming in from the landscape. It's all stuff that's happening right there in the water body. Similarly, if our only problem was under these high flow conditions and both of these looked good, we could say with pretty good certainty that this is more of a non-point source pollution problem, where it's stuff from the landscape that's coming in causing the problems. And that's not to say that the other like direct sources aren't contributing, but they're the bigger issue. However, in this case, what this tells us is that it's really a combination of all the things out there across the watershed that are influencing water quality. So basically, to tell us like how much of a reduction we need, we can do some math and figure out the distance between these mean values and this allowable line, so to speak. So basically, that's what we do. We develop those differences and then do some math and add it all together. And in this case, the existing load is presented here in this blue line. So this is what the actual bacteria load is. And that's, again, the concentration times the flow rate to get a volume. And these are in billions of most probable numbers. So that's a different way of looking at how many E. coli are in a water body. So billions of E. coli per year is what these are in. And then this next line depicts what the needed load reduction is to get down to that water quality standard. So again, those are in billions. So under the low flows, it's about one, I guess, actually trillion, because there's 1,000 billions there. And then under the high flows, it's about 3 trillion. So those are huge numbers, kind of mind-boggling. But I will say that as far as load reductions needed are concerned, I've seen much, much higher numbers in other water bodies across the state. So not to say that there's not work to be done, but it's not as bad as I've seen in some other watersheds. So it's quite manageable. So whenever we aggregate it all, the total annual load reduction that we need to hit is this 5.9 billion bacteria across the whole watershed. And this is for Petronila. similar, just the same on San Fernando. Use an easier word, getting tongue tied up here. Been talking too long. For Petronila, it's pretty much the same story, just different numbers from the load duration curve. So again, we see average values in each of the flow categories that are above that water quality standard. So obviously a needed reduction to get that water quality down to meeting that bacteria standard. And you might be asking yourself, okay, what's the nutrient stuff look like? So since there are not nutrient standards developed for Petronila and San Fernando, we did not develop these load duration curves. And the reason being is that since there's no standard, we don't want to set a precedent or anything like that, because the state is in the process of setting these standards, and they may come up with a different number for us to shoot at for these water bodies. And that's really why they establish those screening levels, is to give themselves time to evaluate that water quality or what's appropriate across the state, because it's not necessarily the same in all situations. And I think the state actually learned a good lesson whenever they applied bacteria standards, because they basically said, okay, everything's going to have to stick to the same standard. And if you think about all the creeks and rivers that you've seen in your drive across Texas, they're not all the same, you know, and not all used the same. So those standards aren't necessarily appropriate. So for nutrients, they're doing their homework and actually putting some good thought into this. So like I said, we didn't want to get the cart in front of the horse and develop a load duration curve using a target that is most likely not accurate. So we skipped over that. Next way we looked at the pollutant sources across the water body were to do basically a spatial analysis of potential E. coli loads out there. So this is a pretty busy map. Basically what we did here is we took the two watersheds, so Petronila up here, San Fernando down here, and then further subdivided it into smaller units that we call subbasins or subwatersheds. And we attempt to keep these things relatively the same size. It doesn't always work out that way, but they're all hydrologically connected to each other, and we try to keep them on the flow line. So it makes sense that everything is moving from left to right down towards the bay. And essentially what we do is we go in and apply the various pollution source types out there across the watershed that are in the landscape, and basically do a count by subbasin for each of those specific sources and see which areas have higher potential for E. coli loading from those respective sources. So within the watershed plan, the document that I'm going to send to y'all after the meeting, we've got individual maps for septic systems, for wastewater, for pets, for livestock, for feral hogs, for deer. And I think that's it. I might be missing one. But anyways, we've got each of those maps. And what these do is it basically shows us what that potential is across the watershed. So this is the total potential E. coli load for the entire watershed. And what that is we basically added together all of those sources that I just listed off and summed them up by subbasin to see which areas of the watershed had the highest potential for E. coli loading relative to other parts of the watershed. So basically what you're looking at is a color-coded map that shows the green areas, like the darkest green is the lowest potential E. coli load from across the watershed, and the red is the highest potential E. coli load from across the watershed. And as you look at those individual maps, you'll see some similarities in some of the color codings and some differences. And it's largely based on where that specific source is distributed across the watershed. So for instance, like in this map, you can see the subwatershed that includes Kingsville and the ones that include Alice show the highest potential. And the big difference, or the big reason for that is that those sources that are more common in an urban area, they influence those subwatersheds, whereas they don't influence any of the other areas out there. So it's not to say that, like pets, for example, it's not to say that there's not pets in other parts of the watershed, just not as many of them. So that potential load, it adds up a lot faster in those urban areas than it does in the rural areas. So this doesn't mean that that is the actual case. This is a potential E. coli load. So this doesn't take into account any of the factors in nature that affect E. coli and how they live and die. This is literally the worst case scenario of what's coming out of the animal or coming out of the wastewater treatment plant or coming out of the septic system if it's a total failure. So in reality, those loads are a lot less than that from those specific sources. But what this does is that it gives us an idea of where in the watershed there's a bigger potential for those E. coli sources to influence water quality. So it helps us to help prioritizing and show where we would maybe get more bang for the buck from a prioritization perspective. So again, we've got individual maps for each of the sources in the watershed plan that you can look at and digest a little bit easier than just this total map. Okay, so the next chapter kind of uses all that information we just talked about and starts to spell out the recommended implementation strategies that have been developed for the watershed. And the content that's included in this chapter all came out of discussions from the various meetings that we've had over the course of the project. So we started off last year with a general kickoff meeting like this. We had it on Zoom since we were still locked down and all that fun stuff. But we had a good turnout for that one, had some good discussion. And then from there, we broke out into working groups, which focused on more specific issues. So we had a wastewater working group that talked about wastewater treatment facilities and septic systems. We had I guess, ag and natural resources that talked about livestock and wildlife and cropland. We had an urban issues work group that talked about stormwater, pets, and things of that nature. And then illegal dumping was a conversation in a fair number of those working groups. But anyways, we had multiple meetings with those work groups, talked through things, talked about management strategies that were reasonable in this neck of the woods, that were feasible, that people might actually be interested in implementing, and came up with some ideas on what some reasonable numbers of some of those would be. So we've got management recommendations that basically address each of these sources that are listed over here. So one for livestock, feral hogs, septic systems, urban landscapes. This addresses both loading from pets and from fertilizer. We got a stormwater that also kind of dovetails on the pets and fertilizer because stormwater carries all that stuff downstream. But it's a different enough that we have a separate management recommendation. Then we have wastewater treatment facilities and sanitary sewer overflows, and then again, the illicit dumping. And basically what each one of these management recommendations does is it describes basically the issue, talks about what specific items, what practices, what thoughts and ideas are included in this management recommendation, list out some priority subwatersheds. So again, going back to that color-coded map I was talking to you about previously, it uses those subwatersheds kind of as priority areas. And then it provides some cost estimates and estimates for potential load reductions from implementation of that practice. So obviously the load reductions are just math. This is kind of a best case scenario. If everything works out the way the math suggests, then this is what we might see in stream. So essentially that is an important part of the plan though, because whenever these plans get reviewed, the potential load reductions from the management recommendations need to at least add up to that needed load reduction that we defined earlier. So in this case, we're aiming for the moon, we're aiming high. And the theory there is that all of these things are likely not going to be implemented. So if we get a portion of them and are still aiming high, then hopefully we'll still hit that water quality target. Because at the end of the day, everything that's in this plan is voluntary and it relies upon individuals or entities to actually do the work to implement the practices. So each one of those management recommendations that's included in there focuses on addressing that bacteria concern or impairment. There are nutrient benefits to a lot of these practices. Obviously, we're not, again, shooting for a specific load reduction for nutrients or anything like that, but a lot of the stuff does have nutrient benefits. And we do some math to show what potential nutrient benefits we could see from the various practices. But again, it's just a hypothetical type calculation that's done there. So here's what kind of the Cliff Notes version of each of the recommended strategies. So for livestock, the plan, it really focuses on utilizing existing tools that are out there already. So conservation plans through NRCS, and water quality management plans through your local soil and water conservation district and the state soil and water conservation board. So that basically what these plans do is that whenever a landowner comes in and requests those plans, they get technical assistance from NRCS and the soil and water conservation districts to come out and basically talk with the landowner about goals and objectives for the property, and then essentially recommend some management practices that they can implement on their property to help not only improve water quality, but also meet their management goals for that property. So the conversation that we had in the working group to do this was that it was feasible to develop 200 of these plans for each watershed, so 400 in total. And whenever I was putting all this together and doing the math, I was like, that doesn't quite add up, because a lot of these plans are going to go on cropland specific properties and not necessarily to livestock only operations. So what I did is I basically looked at the percentage of grazing land in each of the watersheds versus the percentage of cropland in the watershed, and basically just did a calculation to say what's appropriate. So Petronila Creek obviously is more dominated by cropland than grazing lands. So I think it was 28%, 29%. So I multiplied 29% by 200 and came up with 56 plans. So the assumption is that 56 of that 200 will actually address livestock loadings primarily. There may be some that include both, but the assumption for, at least for the math, is that we're going to do 56 plans. And then San Fernando, it's kind of the inverse. A lot more grazing land out there than it is cropland. So that number is a lot higher. And then we actually used the National Ag Statistics information to estimate the size of each operation and the number of livestock in each operation. So I think for Petronila, it was 53 head per plan is what the assumption was. And then San Fernando, I think it was 38. I might be wrong on that, but it's listed in the watershed plan. So basically from there, we use the common practices. So we got information from NRCS about what practices have been implemented in the watersheds, and basically just looked through the list to see what was most commonly used, and then what practices actually applied for grazing management and livestock related uses. And entities like the Ag Research Service from USDA and folks like that have done research over the years to show what kind of bacteria reductions you can get from specific practices. So for those that we have numbers for, we actually pulled a few of those out that were appropriate. A lot of them are like developed in the Northeast and not proper for the coastal bend or anything. So we took the ones that made sense, used those load reduction estimates, like a median value. We didn't assume that we were going to have the perfect scenario, but we're hoping for better than the worst case as well. But basically use the cattle numbers and just did the math to come up with an estimated load reduction that we would get per year out of these plans. So you can see that the numbers for livestock alone are pretty significant. So going back to that needed load reduction, if you put it in scientific notation like these guys are here, that was, I think, 5.9 times 10 to the 12 was the needed load reduction. So you can see that livestock alone, if everything works as the math suggests, is above and beyond that. Now, that said, this is what you would be able to reduce across the landscape. So that doesn't necessarily equate to what's going to be realized in stream, because again, you don't have runoff producing rain events every day. So whatever fecal matter a cow may deposit across the watershed, the vast majority of it's going to dry out and turn into soil before the next rain event can push it down to the stream. So we're not expecting to see this number of reduction in the creeks, but across the watershed, it's very realistic. And then same with nitrogen and phosphorus. So again, we did the math and some published values and came up with these potential nitrogen and phosphorus reductions just by managing livestock. Similarly, with feral hogs, I got it right that time. Didn't get tongue-tied. With feral hogs, the conversation is just physically removing them from the watershed, so getting rid of them by whatever means possible. Obviously, we'd love to get rid of all of them, but that's not realistic. 15% is what was considered feasible. Hopefully, we can get higher than that, but from just a sheer target perspective, that was deemed to be appropriate for the watershed. So what that equates to is a reduction of about 3,300 head across the two watersheds. And again, using known information about how much bacteria is in hog poop and how much nitrogen and phosphorus is in there. If we get rid of that many hogs, we're going to realize that level of reduction across the two watersheds. So again, those are bigger numbers than the needed load reduction in stream, but we're not assuming that all of that's going to be realized in the creek either. So moving down the line for septic systems, same story there. 100 failing septic systems being repaired or replaced was the target that the working group came up with. Just based on the numbers between the two watersheds, we split that between 60 in Petronila and 40 in San Fernando. And again, did the math using published literature values and the average number of people per house across the area, and came up with some pretty substantial load reductions for E. coli being possible, and then the nitrogen and phosphorus reductions as well. So again, same story here. We're not assuming that all of it's going to hit the stream or be taken out of the stream, but at least taken out of the watershed. And then the lawn and landscapes, this focuses, well, yes. No, not from a math perspective, it wouldn't. I mean, the assumption is that if the septic system is fully functioning, that it's properly treating it and there's no influence whatsoever. So whether it be an aerobic system that's got advanced treatment, it's spraying effluent out, or if it's the conventional like drain field and all that. So the soil's the final treatment, and in theory, the soil receives all of that effluent, it treats it, holds it on site. And similarly with the wastewater treatment facility, if it's going there, wastewater treatment plant's operating properly, the assumption is that it's not that big of an impact. I mean, I know the data I've seen from good plants that are doing well, I mean, they're pushing out like single digit E. coli in their effluent. It's 2, 3, 5, something like that. Now, you get a Hurricane Harvey, all bets are off. Obviously, you got more problems to deal with than you can manage. So you get some issues in events like that. And same with septics. I mean, if your ground is fully saturated, then obviously they're not going to be functioning properly, but that's not a common thing. So it would be the same. And if we did connect a lot of septic systems to a community sewer, it would be treated as a repair or replacement, essentially, where you're replacing that failing system with something that is functioning. So the math would essentially be the same without site-specific data. Now, if we had data on exactly what the influence of those systems were and exactly what the efficiency of the new system or the wastewater treatment plant were, we could do the actual math. But for this, that's all in the future, so we can't come up with that. So for the lawn and landscapes, this one really focuses more on the pets than fertilizer. Obviously, fertilizer in the landscape is not a bacteria contributor unless you're putting out like raw litter or something like that from a poultry house or a feedlot. But in town, most people don't do that. It's frowned upon for the most part. But dogs, if they're not picked up after, they can have a big influence. So the conversation is that maybe some dog waste stations being installed in public areas would be useful, and then education and outreach just to the populace would be helpful as well. And the thought is that we might be able to change behavior in 10% of the population to actually pick up after their dogs. So we took 10% of the dog populations in the two watersheds, and again did the math and came up with those theoretical load reductions for E. coli, nitrogen and phosphorus there as well. And the assumption is that if the dog waste is picked up, thrown into the trash, taken to the landfill, that it's not going to influence water quality. And we also assume that it's not a 100% removal, because you're not going to expect people to get down there and like scrub the grass and bleach it or anything like that. They're just going to pick up the bulk material and get it out of there. So so that's the assessment there. And then for stormwater and wastewater, those are harder to do hypothetical math on because the numbers vary so widely based on what specific practices are done, especially in stormwater, and then like what volume of practices there are. I mean, if you put in a stormwater feature the size of this room, it's going to have a lot less influence than a 10-acre detention pond or something like that. So we did not do any estimated load reductions here, but we talked about what the potential is and what the need is. And obviously the bigger concern from stormwater is flooding, but there's a lot of opportunity to address water quality with some of those flood mitigation practices as well. So if they're properly designed, properly maintained, they can have some pretty significant water quality effects as well. So that's the hope, and the goal of this practice is to increase information transfer to folks that are planning out these stormwater features, and doing that work to try to maybe get them to use some other methods that have a bigger storm or water quality impact than maybe some of the traditional methods. And wastewater and sanitary sewer overflows, again, this is a big one that there's a lot of different parts and plants out there that are in different states of, I guess, operational efficiency and things like that. There is a big push by Nueces River Authority to improve operation and maintenance of a lot of the smaller facilities out there. So I know they're in talks right now to basically establish agreements with the city or the county, whoever owns the wastewater treatment plant, to operate and maintain those plants, do repairs and upgrades over time, and get them into a better situation. So, and again, each one of those plants is operating at a different level, and they have different influences on water quality. And then it also relates back to what the new output would be from that. So again, did not calculate any load reduction estimate from that, but talked about the need more so in that management strategy. And then the last one is the illicit dumping. And like I mentioned earlier, there's really not a big concern from bacteria perspective for dumping. It's more so the eyesore, the other things that go along with dumping that are the big concern. But we, again, talked about the need, talked about options for addressing this issue, and talked about the resources that would be put towards that. And then on the right-hand side, basically kind of outlined the reduction needed versus the reductions that are planned. So the need for Petronila and San Fernando creeks are here. So again, the 10 to the 12, so that's a trillion E. coli reduction. And then the plan, so if we add up livestock, septic, wastewater, pets, feral hogs, things of that nature, this is the number of planned reduction that we expect to see from the watershed. So like I said earlier, not necessarily what's going to be realized in stream, but the theory is that by aiming really high, that we will meet this lower needed reduction once these practices are actually implemented. And then the pie charts down here just kind of show the breakdown between the various implementation strategies on what their I guess respective proportion of that reduction is. In Petronila, septic systems are the one that from a potential reduction perspective are the biggest, just because of the number of septic systems that are out there and the amount of E. coli that is generated from a failing septic system. In San Fernando, it's actually pets that are the bigger chunk. And again, this is largely due to the fact that Kingsville and Alice are in that watershed. So that's where the most people in the watershed are. So there's a bigger potential, not necessarily saying that that's going to be the biggest reduction that we see, but just from a math perspective, that's the one that is the biggest. And then septics are second there, livestock are third, and then feral hogs are fourth on that. So just kind of to put it in perspective and talk or show you what it looks like compared to each other. That's what that is. But at the end of the day, the actual reductions that get, I guess, that actually happen, they're all reliant on these practices actually being implemented out there across the watershed. And again, these are voluntary practices, so it's really going to come down to a watershed coordinator pushing these things. NRCS and soil and water conservation districts talking to producers about implementing conservation practices on their land. NRA continue to work with the wastewater treatment facilities to take over or improve operation and maintenance of those places. Things like that are all critical going forward in actually implementing this plan. So Next chapter is the education and outreach component. So that's a big part of the whole process is basically raising awareness about these issues. Like I mentioned earlier with the septic systems, if things are flushing and they're not having issues in their house, most people don't get too excited or concerned about their septic system. But there's a lot of things that if you don't deal with over time, it creates that problem down the line that you do have to deal with. So education outreach is one tool that can really help stave off some of those bigger problems down the line. So this chapter basically describes the different education outreach tools and components and functions and features that are available to use in the watershed and that we're actually looking to do down the line. So I guess the left-hand column talks about the specific items that are spelled out there. So the watershed coordinator, that's really a role for a person that's kind of pushing this along. Because if we just develop this plan, print it, give copies to everybody, it's just going to sit on a shelf and nothing's going to get done. But if you've got somebody that's actually out there talking to people about things and working to capitalize on what's already going on across the watershed, you can actually get some good stuff done. And then they also can keep track of what all's been done to help report back success. So obviously that's the goal of this whole thing, is to improve water quality. And that watershed coordinator role is one that can actually help keep track of how we are doing as far as number of things that have been implemented, changes in water quality, all that stuff. And then meetings and other engagement activities, that's just a way to get people informed about what's going on. So and actually get them out there doing some stuff. And then there's a number of education programs that focus on the various sources and provide good intel on new ways of doing things, perhaps in some cases, or what's going on out there across the watershed and across the state. And then there's a number of existing things that are out there in the watershed already that are great resources that maybe just people don't know about. So chapters 8 and 9 are actually fairly similar. They're both talk about implementation, so kind of what the planned items are. So this is really kind of a boiled down version of those management strategies that we talked about in chapter 6. That basically lists out the number of each practice, the timeline for implementation that was kind of kicked around during those work group meetings. And then we put some cost estimates in there about what costs might actually be. Of course, all bets are off with inflation doing what it is and things just getting generally more expensive. Those numbers are probably wrong, or they will be as soon as we print them, I'm sure. But it gives us an idea about the resources that are actually needed to at least get the ball rolling on implementation. And then it lists some implementation targets about, okay, this is the number that the stakeholders wanted to shoot for. And then chapter 9 talks about those resources that are needed to actually get that stuff done. So whether it be technical assistance or technical resources, and then obviously the financial side is big in some cases, especially like for the wastewater. That one's huge. I think y'all have estimated it at like $41 million to take over and upgrade those various wastewater treatment facilities. So all of that's talked about in these chapters as far as resources and need is concerned. And then the last chapter of the watershed plan is kind of the take-home message and kind of the end goal, if you want to call it that. So it talks about success and what that's going to look like, and kind of the last bit of resources that are needed to quantify that. So obviously, water quality, changing that water quality in stream is the ultimate goal. It's not going to happen fast by any stretch of the imagination. These creeks have been flowing through this country for a long, long time, and water quality's gotten to the point it is over the course of that long, long time. So honestly, it's a long-term change. And even then, changing water quality is still difficult, because you look around the watershed and drive up 77 towards Corpus, there's new stuff going on all the time. So even if we put our best efforts here locally, we still can't change development. We still can't change all the things that are going on across the watershed. So what happens 5 years from now may totally trump what we do on the ground over the next 5 years as far as water quality is concerned. So we're not hanging our hat totally on these water quality targets. Yeah, we're still going to shoot for them and still hope to get to that water quality standard or below. But if we don't, not the end of the world. But to be able to measure water quality and do those assessments going forward, we need to continue that data collection that's going on. So the Clean Rivers program, the Nueces River Authority and SAM and company do a fine job of that. And so obviously continuing that monitoring is kind of the baseline. I mean, that's the bare minimum really. And in a lot of cases, though, that monitoring, you're not going to be able to see those subtle changes in water quality that you might be able to see with some more focused sampling. So if there is a like a big project or something to address stormwater quality that is not currently bracketed by monitoring stations, it might be wise to put in a very focused sampling project to see what stormwater looks like above or upstream of that facility and below, and then see how it impacts water quality. Because CRP monitoring, that's done on a quarterly basis at what, 5 locations in the watershed right now, I think. Okay, yeah. So you got 60 samples a year being collected. I do my math right? No, 80. Look at that. Being collected a year out there. And that's not a huge number to look at those water bodies over the course of a whole year. So you might need some more focused monitoring to evaluate how well a specific practice or suite of practices is actually doing. But until those practices get put in place, you really don't know what that monitoring need is. So it's one of those where we talk about the need, but say the specifics will be detailed later on once we understand better what we're going to monitor and what the actual goal is. This chapter also talks about the data review. So obviously Texas is going to keep on doing their every other year water quality assessments. So that again is kind of the report card for the state. So that's going to be the ultimate goal, is to have it be considered not impaired anymore and taken off of that impaired waters list. But again, that takes a while. So it's going to be a long time before we would even hope to have the water bodies off the list. So there's some other things you can do. You can look at more recent data and kind of look at a rolling average to see how things have been changing in the near term. You can also look at long-term trends to see if things are generally moving in a good direction or not. And then those focused assessments are also useful in seeing how water quality is changing over time. And then the last other way to evaluate success is to really look at some of those targets that were included in the plan. So was it the basically how many of this practice did we say we were going to implement, and then keeping track of how many actually have been implemented. So if we're making good progress on hitting those targets, that's another way to say, you know what, this is a pretty successful process. We're getting a lot done and looking at how well we're meeting those targets along the way. And then the last part of this chapter is to talk about adaptive management. So like I said earlier, regardless of what all we do with this plan, things change over time. So this plan may not pan out the way that we think it's going to. So 5 years down the road, after we've implemented half the stuff that's in here, we may say, water quality is getting worse. This isn't working. What else can we do? So this adaptive management section talks about the need to kind of reevaluate things down the line and see, okay, are we making some progress? Are we not? Are these implementation targets still feasible? Did we aim way too high? Did we undershoot? Things like that. So it's basically a mechanism to go back to the drawing board and kind of reevaluate things if we need to. So it's not to say that we will, but sometimes we don't know what's going to happen down the road, and there may be some big development or something like that occurs that really changes the nature of water quality out there. So that's what that section talks about. So that is the last chapter of the watershed plan, and currently those chapters are all that we've got developed. Yes, sir.
And it may not have to do with anything, but I know you're focusing on Petronila and something on the creek, but down around neighboring Alice and Jim Wells County, they have inlets that are coming in Lattice Creek and Chippewa Creek. Would that have any play on quality?
Not for these two. They're not hydrologically connected because they flow directly into the bay. But that's not to say that they don't have their own problems and own needs. So I know Los Olmos, for example, is one that is a concern. There's basically just not enough data that's been collected out there to fully understand the problem yet. So it's probably going to be in the same boat as Petronila and San Fernando. So really the trigger that kind of starts these whole processes is when a water body is listed as impaired from the state. And I don't know, Mike, Sam, do y'all know if those creeks are even evaluated by the state? No.
Sorry, we don't evaluate those.
Okay. Okay.
In Jimos County, right, Fernando comes up in Port Cleveland one,
Mm-hmm.
and then Lattice Creek, right where you use the Alice, Lattice Creek runs into San Diego, and it comes back around towards Alice.
Okay.
Connects to the San Fernando.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
Gotcha. I misunderstood. Sorry about that. So yeah. So let me grab this map.
Maybe also connect South Ave coming in. Yeah, because I know that they're not always flowing.
Mhm.
But if we have a torrential rain or anything like that, then they will be flowing and they will be coming into.
Right. Right. So basically this watershed plan, it's going to be effectively covering this whole area out here. So yeah, those two creeks are certainly in that watershed area. And basically all the management recommendations and things that are included in there are applicable to those specific water bodies as well, and the land that drains into them. So as far as
The reason I asked that is because later on in the future, if this comes to fruition and everything is going on planned, then we may have the city of Alice or even Jim Wells County will have to somehow not guarantee, but do what we need to do so we don't contaminate during the flow.
right. I mean, it's a group effort. So there's something that everybody can do to improve water quality. And again, everything that's in this plan is voluntary, so there's not going to be any requirements from anybody. But that said, water quality is not going to improve if people don't do some additional stuff. So obviously, what we're doing now is not necessarily good enough from a water quality perspective. But there's a lot of stuff that's on the books, like with all the discussion about the flood management activity in the area. I mean, that's a huge potential change that could impact water quality in a good way. So it's an opportunity to kind of think about that aspect of it as well. I know flooding is the big concern, but water quality is it's a rider on the back of that. So we can.
So later on, we build on this plan.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So.
I think it's just important to point out the voluntary aspect of it, but also there are groups and expertise wastewater that are coming together now. In fact, Sea Grant just quoted that together on the water side that work with the
Yes, sir. Brian.
Not picking on you. No, I was just looking at the difference in the concentrations of the different sites and the location 20806. I think it's on Petronila. Is that more of a like a lake type situation?
It's an impoundment west of US 77.
Okay. So you have settling and stuff. Probably.
Yes, and we found a lot of our salt issues east of 77.
Okay.
And bacteria wise, that pool you're talking about is always a lot lower than what counts for.
That's what I think I remembered that, and that's what I wanted to confirm.
Yeah, there's a couple of wastewater plants, and I have a little update with good news items I'd like to share with everybody. Last week, well, January has been kind of busy for us. I can't really go into details, but we did find a major source of bacteria in near 77, and so that's been addressed, and hopefully will not continue. Some raw sewage was mistakenly put in the root of the creek for a long time now. It was some sort of an error that was made. Hopefully that's addressed and fixed. We went out and sampled last week and got really low bacteria numbers right below the 13096 station, which is near the Driscoll plant.
Okay.
So our numbers were 52 colony forming units when we normally find over 2,400. So 2,400 down to 52. The problem is still downstream a little bit. I don't think the creek is flushed out yet. So we have about 1,500 downstream, but that site is usually over 2,400 polyform units as well. So we're going to really put our fingers crossed next month if we get some good numbers all across the board. We're very hopeful.
Yeah.
And also there was one of the illegal dumping sites on FM 70 on Petronila Creek. That was recently cleaned up by TxDOT. They went out this last month. I just posted about it on our Clean Rivers page, Facebook page this morning. So I have some pictures, and Adrian was conducting our SRA program field audit. So he was with me. He saw it all cleaned out. So we're working on a lot of these
Good.
measures as we go. We're definitely not waiting until the report is done and the funding is coming. We're using whatever and just keeping our ears open and eyes open and trying to fix these problems. At the wastewater plant, we're seeking funding right now. We have some potential sources that can help us come up with these upgrades that are needed. $40 million, $40.5 million. There could be some federal money coming down the pipeline. We're our fingers crossed again for that, but that would be a huge benefit to these wastewater plants in the area. So that's pretty much. And then our sampling on San Fernando Creek was almost near standard. It was 190.
Okay.
So usually we have pretty high numbers, and that might just be winter. We didn't find any smoking guns on the San Fernando yet. But that was 52 last week. So that's below the standard. At 126. So we're hopefully, we had one really good number. In fact, I think it was back in maybe almost a year ago. And then during the flood, actually, we had really low numbers. During the third, there was 3 2,000 CFS events last year, and we sampled on the peak of the third one, and those water quality was great. After 3 flushes, flush.
Cleaned it out.
That's a little update for now.
What you got, Mike? Right. Yeah. I think some text in there. I don't know where it would be best put in there. Maybe maybe a different chapter, like you said, like other area concerns or something like that, because Los Alamos, and then obviously right around the bay with the septic systems there, those are obviously not included in this watershed area that's drawn on the map, but still a very big driver or potential driver of in-bay water quality, and certainly a big local concern. So right. Right. Yeah, I know. Just walking through my neighborhood in the springtime, when people are fertilizing. I think a lot of folks are trying to grow the sidewalk because they're fertilizing the heck out of that thing, and it's simple stuff like that makes a big difference at the end of the day.
I have one more thing to say about Los Alamos Street. I did contact TCQ about trying to get that on the 303 list quicker. They told me at one time I believe it was needed 10 samples to get the site system. That's what I thought for a long time, and then apparently they changed that to 20. So we're really close to having 20. There is a meeting about these standards coming up. I asked TCQ rep to keep us in the loop. We can actually try to sway that vote, get that listed sooner rather than later. percentage, I mean, we could even have 0 bacteria next few sampling events, and the average would still be over the standard.
Yeah, we're impossible because we're all negatively collected, so it's really showing us. Seems like a brown tie out, just kind of makes a hole in there. Right, the rest of the bed spreads out the muscle.
Really shallow. The bats are back. So evidence of it, but
Well, already they're early.
lining up the creek side. We, walked as far as we could downstream,
Mm-hmm.
and we didn't see too many. The water was a lot fresher than usually. It's super saline there, but must have had a flushing.
Right. But yeah, that's a good point, Mike. We can certainly add some extra language in there that talks about other concerns that are adjacent to the watershed. Because I mean, at the end of the day, these plans are very similar. And honestly, the management recommendations that would be applicable to Los Olmos are probably very similar to the ones that are in here. So it could be an extension of this. So maybe if we do have to go back to the drawing board in a few years, it would be appropriate to simply just add Los Olmos to the watershed plan at that point, and not develop a whole separate plan or anything like that. I know some people are like, oh, like this watershed area is way too big. Yeah, it's big, but at the same time, if we split this up into 4 separate watershed plans, they're all going to be very, very similar to each other. So there's a kind of an economies of scale type thing there. But yeah, Ron.
I will say, the fortunate thing with most of a lot of watershed being in the coastal zone, there's a lot more flexibility. They use $319 in the coastal zone with the source abatement program and all that. So we can, if we identify issues, fix septic systems there, we can, put some stuff, and, if we get a soil and water conservation technician, they can, I mean, if the district wants them to work in the coastal zone, even outside of the watershed, the by all means, we'd be glad to let do that. So it's not, there's some latitude, a lot of latitude with that.
Right. Other questions, comments, thoughts, anything? Okay, so like I said, those slides I just talked about, that's the current content of the plan. So it's just literally chapters 1 through 10. The stuff that we still have to add to this thing are all of the things you see in the front of a document, the cover page, the table of contents, the list of tables, figures, all that fun stuff still needs to be added. It's pretty straightforward stuff that doesn't usually elicit a whole lot of comment or question from reviewers. And then in the back of the plan, we also add some appendices back there that further explain the math that I was talking about on these load reductions and estimates from the various practices. We do that element reference list that I mentioned earlier, where we point out, hey, this element can be found on page 17, third paragraph. So we really give EPA clear instructions on where to find those respective items. So all of that's yet to be added, and we'll get that done over the next several weeks. But at this point, my thinking is that we go ahead and send out the current draft of the watershed plan as it stands for review by watershed stakeholders. So my goal is to get this thing out either Friday or Monday. I can work on that extra content and include that in there if you want, Mike, before we roll it out. I don't think it'll take too long to draft up some information regarding that and include in there. So we can do that. And then basically give you all a chance to read through this thing. I'm not going to lie, it's a lot of words and they're not the most riveting words that have ever been written. So again, if you have insomnia and need some help sleeping, this will probably do the trick. But it is important for y'all to take a look through there, make sure that what's written down and what's described is what we talked about through the course of the process, and ask questions and make sure it is what y'all want it to be, because this is truly y'all's plan. I'm just the sap that has to write it. And I try to take good notes. Sometimes what I hear and what I write are not the same thing. And same thing with typing. My fingers and brain work at a very different speed oftentimes. So it's not necessarily right, is what I'm saying. So definitely want y'all's comments, want y'all's thoughts and ideas. And our job is to make sure that that is actually a plan that y'all are cool with and willing to sign off on as a good plan. So that's the review process, and that's what we want to get out of that. So phone calls with thoughts, ideas are great. Emails with specific items. You can even mark up a paper copy of it and send it to me in the mail. And I'll be glad to send paper copies out as well. We'll initially just send I guess a PDF and have a link to a Word document on the website where it can be downloaded if y'all want it that way. But I can send you a paper copy if you so desire. Hand in a review, and we'll work on adding all the stuff in the front, add those appendices, and then just generally go through the document and make sure the grammar's proper in all the places, make sure that we're using consistent terminology and acronyms are right and all that fun stuff that makes it an easier document to read. And then once we get comments back from y'all, we'll obviously work on addressing those comments and getting things adjusted as y'all see fit. And then from there, we can either have a final stakeholder meeting to go through and talk about the comments that were received and talk about the adjustments that are made, or we don't necessarily have to. So it's been kind of a toss-up on other watershed plans I've worked on over the years, where some plans, there's some pretty substantial changes that are requested and appropriate. So in those situations, I'm all for having another meeting and making sure that everybody's well aware of what was changed and what was adjusted along the way. But there's been other plans where everybody's like, no, you did a good job. You listened well, and this looks good to us. So there's not really a need to have another meeting and take up a couple hours of your day or anything like that. So my suggestion is that we kind of wait and see what the level of comments are that are returned on the plan before we decide on the next meeting. But if we do have another meeting, probably towards the end of March would be reasonable in my mind. That gives time for y'all to have multiple weeks to take a look at it and send comments my way, and then gives us a little bit of time to address those comments and get the T's crossed and the I's dotted. And then as long as everything is moving along nicely and there's no derailments or anything like that, really, I think this will be ready to send off for final agency review somewhere around April 1st. And then reviews should take about 30 days a piece, but that's always debatable. So hopefully by really kind of the end of May, first part of June, we ought to have word on what needs to be changed or any questions or comments or concerns that EPA has by that point. So I don't foresee anything big coming out of this one. I think it should be relatively easy review, but I've been wrong on that before. So sure, now that I say that, I'll eat my words and there'll be some big something that's not in there. But I think we got all the bases covered on that. So how's that sound as far as a plan of action moving forward from y'all's perspective? Seem reasonable? So, okay. Well, Mike, we'll talk about the extra chapter stuff. And like I said, I think I can get that done here in the next couple of days. So I think we can add that and then roll it out on Monday or something like that to everybody to take a look at. And that still gives plenty of time for review and comment and all that good stuff. So I guess that was the last of the content. If y'all have got any questions or think of something along the way, there's my phone number, email, and then there's the project website with further info about things. We will post links to the documents there. I'll also send it directly to you in email. So please do make sure that you got a good email address on the sign-in sheet. So that way we can make sure that you get the document. And with that, that's all I had as far as the meeting content is concerned. Any last questions, comments, concerns, anything? If not, thank you all very much for coming out today. Mike?
What happened this in place? Which ones are fixing
Absolutely. So yeah, having this watershed plan in place, it basically tells anybody and everybody that, hey, we've gotten people from the local watershed together, talked about these water quality concerns, put the best science available on the table, and made some logical decisions at the local level to address these problems. And then once this plan is accepted by EPA, it unlocks the door for potential grant funding down the line for various projects. It's not going to fund everything. Like if you want to build a brand new wastewater treatment plant, EPA is not going to grant you money for that out of this program. This is all, it unlocks the door to money to address non-point source issues across a watershed. So infrastructure projects are not applicable, but there's other options for those, like the infrastructure bill that Sam was talking about. But having this plan in place shows that we've put together a concerted effort to address these water quality concerns and have a plan that we developed at the local level. So in other cases, it's actually been used kind of as an insurance policy against lawsuits. So not here in Texas, but in the Northwest, there was a effort to sue the logging industry because they weren't protecting water quality. They had a similar plan in place that they had worked with the local loggers, the stakeholders, and come up with a plan to protect water quality. And that lawsuit actually ended up in the U.S. Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court was like, they did what they're supposed to do. They've done their homework. The agencies have reviewed it. They've signed off on it, and they threw the case out. They were like, "This is ridiculous." So this is a good thing to have in place on multiple levels. So yeah, this is a good step in the right direction. It's not the silver bullet that's going to solve all the problems or anything like that, but it unlocks some additional tools in the toolbox to help provide resources for those activities that are included in the plan.
Sure, and those on top of wastewater plants. Get some of that funding in place.
Right. Right. Yeah, and even having that acknowledged in this watershed plan helps their case, because this is something that they can point to and say, look, this is, stakeholders acknowledge that this is a big problem. We're not just telling you what we're telling you. It's written down, been reviewed by the agencies, and accepted as a good plan. So it provides some credence to a lot of the needs that are out there, and provides some justification to people that may be funding stuff. So like I know for ag producers, at least from NRCS, if their property is in an area that has an accepted watershed plan, they get bonus points on an EQIP application for funding. So doesn't necessarily mean that it's a shoe-in, but they get a little bump on the priority list from that perspective. So there's tons and tons of benefits to these things that are available across the board. So yeah, thanks everybody for coming out. Certainly appreciate y'all's time today, and be glad to chat about anything else. But, and y'all travel safe going back home and back to work and all that. Mm-hmm.